The invitation to join the hiking trip had seemed innocuous at first, a spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by boredom and a desire for fresh air. My friend Matt had been insistent. "Come on, it's just my family. My Aunt Diane will be there too. She's great. You'll love her." Diane had been the last person I'd expected. She wasn't the typical retiree, content with garden parties and book clubs. Instead, she was vibrant and sharp, with a quiet confidence that made her seem younger than her years. From the moment we'd met, I'd been struck by her. It wasn't just her striking silver hair or the graceful way she carried herself. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put into words. The first day of the trip had been uneventful but pleasant. We'd followed the winding trail through the dense forest, the ground soft underfoot, and the scent of pine heavy in the air. Diane had been at the front for most of it, her strides purposeful and steady. I found myself watching her more than I should have, admiring the way the sunlight caught her profile, or the way she laughed at Matt's dry humor. That evening, we'd set up camp in a small clearing by a creek. As the fire crackled and the sky deepened to a rich indigo, Diane had taken a seat beside me, her presence warm and grounding. The conversation had flowed easily, touching on everything from favorite books to her past travels. "You must think it strange, me tagging along on these trips," she said at one point, her tone light but her eyes searching. "Not at all," I replied quickly. "It's refreshing, actually. You're not like most people your age." She laughed, a soft melodic sound. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said, and colored up with triumph. "Oh, I didn't realize I was such a dream." The connection between us had been subtle then, a spark rather than a flame. But as the days passed, it grew harder to ignore. The second day of the hike brought us deeper into the wilderness. The air grew cooler as the trail climbed, and the sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, took on a hushed quality, as if the trees themselves were guarding some ancient secret. Diane remained effortlessly composed, her pace steady, even as the terrain grew more challenging. Matt lagged behind, stopping frequently to snap photos or complain about the weight of his pack. "Think he'll make it?" I asked Diane as we paused at a scenic overlook. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills blanketed in a sea of green, broken only by the shimmer of a distant river. She smiled, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "He'll make it. He just likes to grumble." There was a quiet confidence in the way she spoke, a certainty that seemed to extend beyond her nephew's hiking stamina. I found myself leaning into her presence, drawn to the calm she exuded. It was something I hadn't realized I'd been craving. We lingered there longer than we should have, the conversation meandering into unexpected territory. Diane told me about her life before retirement, a career in teaching, a marriage that had ended amicably but left her wary of new beginnings. "It's funny," she mused, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You spend so much of your life trying to do the right thing, to make the right choices, but sometimes you wonder if you missed out on something by playing it safe." Her words lingered in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to respond, to tell her I understood, but the intensity of the moment left me grasping for words. Before I could find them, Matt's voice echoed up the trail, breaking the spell. "Hey, you two planning to leave me behind?" Diane chuckled, the sound soft but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Come on," she said, her hand brushing lightly against my arm as she turned back toward the trail. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, my pulse quickening despite the cool mountain air. By the time we reached the next campsite, the sun was dipping low, its golden rays filtering through the trees and painting the world in shades of amber. Diane and I worked together to set up the tents, our movements synchronized in a way that felt natural, almost practiced. Matt busied himself collecting firewood, leaving us alone in the quiet of the clearing. As I drove the final stake into the ground, Diane straightened, stretching her arms above her head. The motion pulled her shirt taut against her frame, and I caught myself staring, quickly looking away before she noticed. As I drove the final stake into the ground, Diane straightened, stretching her arms above her head. As I drove the final stake into the ground, it perfectly. Long day, she said, her voice light but edged with fatigue. I nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from my brow. You held up better than the rest of us. Years of practice, she replied with a small smile. This trail used to be my escape when I needed to clear my head. It's been a while since I've had someone to share it with. Her words caught me off guard, the vulnerability in them stark against the backdrop of her usual poise. I hesitated, unsure if I should respond, but the way she looked at me, steady, unflinching, made it impossible to stay silent. I'm glad you invited me, I said finally. It's different from anything I've done before. Diane's smile softened, and for a moment, the space between us felt charged, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to brush a stray leaf from my shoulder. The gesture was innocent, but the warmth of her touch lingered long after she pulled away. Dinner? She asked, her tone casual, as if the moment hadn't just shifted into something deeper. That night, the three of us sat around the fire, the crackling flames casting dancing shadows across the clearing. Matt was in high spirits, recounting an old camping story that Diane and I both laughed at, though I found it increasingly difficult to focus. My attention kept drifting to her. How the firelight caught the silver in her hair, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. When Matt finally excused himself to his tent, muttering something about an early start tomorrow, the atmosphere shifted. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable, a shared understanding settling between us. Do you miss it? I asked, breaking the quiet. Teaching, I mean. Diane considered the question for a moment, her gaze fixed on the fire. Sometimes, but I don't think it was the teaching itself I loved. It was the connection, helping people figure out who they are, what they're capable of. That's what I miss. Her honesty was disarming, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn to the rawness of her words. I think you're still doing that, I said softly. Even now. She looked at me then, her expression unreadable. You're kind, she said, after a moment, her voice quiet but steady. More than you know. The fire crackled between us, its warmth a stark contrast to the cool night air. Diane shifted slightly, her knee brushing against mine. The contact was subtle, accidental, but it sent a thrill through me nonetheless. I couldn't tell if she felt it too, but she didn't pull away. We should get some rest, she said finally, her tone betraying none of the tension that had settled between us. Yeah, I agreed, though the thought of leaving this moment behind felt almost unbearable. Diane stood, her movements graceful as she gathered the remnants of the meal and placed them in the pack. I watched her retreat to her tent, the flap closing softly behind her. For a long time, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and trying to make sense of the storm brewing inside me. The third day of the hike brought a subtle but undeniable shift. The trail grew steeper, the air thinner, but I barely noticed. Every interaction with Diane felt charged, every glance and touch laden with unspoken meaning. She seemed aware of it too, though she gave no indication beyond the occasional lingering look or the faintest of smiles. When we reached a small plateau near midday, Matt wandered off to explore, leaving Diane and me alone again. The view was stunning, snow-capped peaks rising in the distance, the valley below awash in shades of green and gold. but my attention was fixed on her. "You've been quiet," she said, her tone light but probing. "Just taking it all in," I replied, though we both knew it wasn't the full truth. She nodded, her gaze sweeping across the horizon. "It's beautiful, isn't it? How something so vast can make you feel so small." I stepped closer, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "You're beautiful," Diane turned to me, her eyes widening slightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us heavy with the weight of what I'd just said. Then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers grazing mine. "Careful," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the breeze. But she didn't pull away. The silence stretched between us, taut and unyielding, as her words hung in the air. Careful. A warning, perhaps, or a plea. But the way her fingers lingered against mine told a different story. There was no resistance, no retreat, only the quiet, steady pull of something we both knew was impossible to deny. I'm not sure I can be," I said softly, the confession slipping out before I had the chance to second-guess it. "So I fit in between two people. Or sometimes I've been sharing that same past with almost everybody." Diane's gaze held mine, her expression unreadable. The wind stirred her hair, catching the silver strands and carrying them across her face in soft, fleeting arcs. I wanted to reach out, to tuck them behind her ear, but the weight of the moment kept me frozen in place. "You don't know what you're saying," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. It was softer now, almost wistful, and her fingers, still resting lightly against mine, made no move to withdraw. "I think I do," I said, taking a small step closer. The distance between us felt both vast and impossibly small, a chasm bridged by nothing more than the fragile thread of unspoken understanding. "You're different. There's something about you I can't ignore." A flicker of something crossed her face. Doubt, maybe, or fear, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She sighed, her shoulders rising and falling with the weight of whatever battle she was fighting within herself. "This is dangerous," she murmured, though her fingers tightened ever so slightly around mine. "You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you." Stop," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I'd expected. "Stop talking like that, like this is some kind of mistake." Her lips parted, but no words came. I took another step, close enough now that I could see the faint lines etched around her eyes, the softness of her skin where the sunlight kissed it, close enough to see the way her breath hitched just slightly as I raised my hand and let my fingers brush against hers. Calm. I could slightly hear the beat of breath caught in my mouth and made a soft, rustling noise. "You don't have to push me away," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Not if you don't want to." For a long moment, Diane said nothing. Her eyes searched mine, as though trying to find some hidden truth she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. Then slowly, she nodded, so slight it was barely perceptible, but it was enough. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze, the memory of that moment lingering between us like the static charge of an approaching storm. Diane was quieter than usual, her words fewer and her movements more measured, but there was a new kind of softness to her that I couldn't quite place, a quiet surrender, perhaps, or the calm before something irrevocable. When we reached the next campsite, Matt was already there, his pack discarded haphazardly by the fire pit as he stretched out on a fallen log. He greeted us with a wave, oblivious to the shift that had taken place. Diane and I exchanged a brief glance, unspoken words passing between us, before she busied herself unpacking her gear. That evening, as the fire crackled and Matt rambled on about his plans to visit a nearby waterfall the next morning, Diane and I stayed mostly silent. I could feel her presence beside me, the warmth of her body radiating just inches away, and I wondered if she felt the same magnetic pull that had me rooted to the spot. When Matt finally retired to his tent, Diane stood, brushing the dirt from her pants. "I'm going to take a walk," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes flickering to mine for a brief moment. "I'll come with you," I said, standing before I could talk myself out of it. She didn't object, though her expression was unreadable, as she turned and started toward the trail. I followed, a few paces behind, the cool night air prickling against my skin as we left the glow of the fire behind. We walked in silence for a while, the forest alive with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects. The moon hung low in the sky, its light filtering through the branches and casting dappled shadows across the ground. Diane's pace was slow, deliberate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was leading me somewhere. Though where, I couldn't say. When she finally stopped, it was in a small clearing where the trees parted to reveal a patch of sky dotted with stars. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, and I wondered if she felt it too. Diane turned to face me, her expression softer now, though still tinged with the same quiet hesitation that had marked our earlier conversation. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "Because I didn't want to be anywhere else," I replied honestly. She sighed, her gaze dropping to the ground. "This isn't fair to you," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "I know exactly what I'm getting into," I said, stepping closer. My voice was firm, but my heart was pounding so loudly, I was certain she could hear it. "And I don't care." Her eyes met mine then, and the vulnerability I saw there stole the breath from my lungs. For a moment, I thought she might step back, retreat into the safety of her own walls. But instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek in a gesture so tender it almost undid me. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know how to let myself want this." "You don't have to know," I said, covering her hand with mine. "You just have to let it happen." Her eyes searched mine, and for a long, breathless moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, slowly, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss so soft it was almost imperceptible. It was hesitant, testing, as though she were waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, the hesitance giving way to something stronger, more certain. Her hands found their way to my shoulders, her touch anchoring me as I pulled her closer. The warmth of her body against mine, the soft sigh that escaped her lips as our movements became more urgent. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and I was utterly lost in it. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, Diane rested her forehead against mine, her eyes closed. "This is dangerous," she whispered, though there was no conviction in her voice. "Then let it be dangerous," I murmured, my hands still holding her close. "I don't care." Neither of us moved for a long moment, the weight of what we'd just done settling over us like a heavy blanket. But there was no regret, no second guessing, only the quiet certainty that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. The stillness of the clearing enveloped us, the faint rustle of the wind through the trees the only sound. Diane's breathing was shallow, her fingers still resting lightly on my arms, as if afraid that letting go might shatter the fragile moment we'd created. I could feel her trembling, a subtle but unmistakable sign of the battle waging inside her. "Diane," I said softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. She pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting mine. They were wide and glassy, filled with emotions that seemed to spill over one another. Fear, longing, uncertainty, and something else, something deeper, I don't know how to stop this, she murmured, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. Then don't, I replied, my hands finding hers and holding them gently. You don't have to stop. Her gaze dropped to the space between us, her lips parting as if to protest, but no words came. Instead, she stepped closer, her forehead brushing against my chest as her hands tightened around mine. I held her there, letting the silence speak for us, my fingers brushing gently over hers as I tried to reassure her without words. When she finally looked up, there was a new resolve in her eyes, though it was tempered with caution. I don't want to hurt you, she said, her voice barely audible. And I don't want you to wake up one day and regret this. I won't, I said firmly. The certainty in my own voice surprised me, but I knew it was true. I know what this is, and I'm not afraid of it. Diane searched my face, her expression softening with each passing second. Slowly, as though testing the boundaries of what we had just crossed, she reached up and cupped my face in her hands. Her touch was warm, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the line of my jaw. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something, she said, her voice raw. Something I don't know how to navigate. Then let me navigate it with you, I said, my hands resting gently on her waist. We don't have to have all the answers right now. Her lips curved into a small, tentative smile, and she leaned forward, her forehead resting against mine. You make it sound so simple, she murmured, though there was no reproach in her tone. Maybe it is, I replied, my voice steady. Maybe it's just about letting ourselves feel what we feel. For a moment, Diane said nothing, her eyes closing as she seemed to let my words settle. Then, with a soft sigh, she pulled me closer, her lips finding mine once more. This kiss was different, less hesitant, more assured. It carried with it a sense of surrender, a quiet acceptance of what had already begun between us. The walk back to the campsite was slow and unhurried, the weight of what had happened between us lingering in the air. We didn't speak, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, filled with the unspoken understanding that we had crossed into a territory that neither of us could or wanted to retreat from. When we reached the firelight, Diane hesitated, her hand brushing against mine before she pulled away. Good night, she said softly, her eyes lingering on mine for just a moment too long. Good night, I replied, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. She disappeared into her tent, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and the whirlwind of thoughts spinning through my mind. I sat there for a long time, staring into the flames, as I tried to process everything that had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that something had shifted. Something I couldn't undo. The next morning, the trail seemed steeper, the air colder, but the tension between Diane and me had only deepened. Every glance, every accidental brush of our hands felt like a spark igniting a fire that neither of us knew how to control. Matt, oblivious to the shift, led the way with his usual exuberance, his voice carrying over the sound of our boots crunching against the rocky path. Almost there, he called, his tone cheerful as he gestured toward the ridge ahead. Diane and I exchanged a glance, her lips curving into a faint smile that sent a rush of warmth through me. He's determined, isn't he? She said, her voice low enough that only I could hear. Is, I replied, my gaze lingering on her longer than it should have. The final stretch of the hike was grueling, the incline steep and the terrain uneven. Matt surged ahead, his energy seemingly endless, while Diane and I lagged behind. She stumbled at one point, her foot catching on a loose rock, and I instinctively reached out, my hand gripping her arm to steady her. You okay? I asked, my voice filled with concern. She nodded, her cheeks flushed from the exertion. "I'm fine, just clumsy." "You're not clumsy," I said, my hand still resting on her arm. "You're just human." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt as though the world around us had faded into the background. She smiled then, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest tighten. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice barely audible. By the time we reached the ridge, the sun was beginning to set, casting the valley below in hues of gold and crimson. The view was breathtaking, but my attention was fixed on Diane. She stood at the edge of the overlook, her silhouette framed by the vibrant sky, and I felt a wave of emotion crash over me, something raw and unfiltered that I could have risen to the ocean. She felt so right. "You're quiet," she said, turning to face me. Her expression was soft, her eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. "Just taking it all in," I replied, though we both knew I wasn't talking about the view. Diane stepped closer, her gaze searching mine. "This, whatever this is, it's not simple," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And it's not something I ever expected." "Neither did I admitted, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the ground. "I don't want to complicate your life," she said. I deserve to feel this," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Whatever it is, I deserve to feel it. And so do you." Her gaze snapped back to mine, her eyes wide with something that looked like both fear and hope. Slowly, as though testing the limits of what we had already crossed, she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine. "You're too good to me," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Maybe you're the one who's too good to me," I replied, my hand closing gently over hers. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, Diane stepped closer, her arms wrapping around me as she rested her head against my chest, the warmth of her body against mine, the softness of her breath against my neck. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and I knew in that moment that there was no going back. The air around us was still, the quiet only broken by the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Diane's arms remained wrapped around me, her head resting against my chest, as if she were trying to find something solid to hold on to. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, the faint tremble in her fingers where they rested against my back. The vulnerability of it all struck me sharp and unexpected, and I tightened my hold on her without thinking. For a long time, we didn't speak. There was no need to. The silence between us said everything words couldn't. I wanted to tell her what I was feeling, that the thought of stepping away from her now was unbearable, but I didn't trust myself to say it right. Instead, I let my hands move gently against her back, tracing small, soothing circles that seemed to calm the tension in her body. "I feel selfish," Diane murmured finally, her voice muffled against my chest. "I keep telling myself I should let you go, but I can't." Her confession cut through me, raw and unguarded. I pulled back just enough to look at her, my hands moving to rest on her shoulders. "You don't have to let me go," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I'm here because I want to be, because I choose to be." She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine, as though trying to find the truth in my words. Whatever she saw seemed to reach her because the tension in her shoulders eased, and she let out a shaky breath. "I've spent so much of my life trying to do the right thing," she said, her voice trembling, "trying to be the person everyone expects me to be. But this—" She paused, her gaze dropping to where her fingers rested lightly against my chest. "This is different. You're different." I caught her hands in mine, holding them firmly but gently. "Maybe that's why it feels right," I said, because it's not about what anyone else thinks. It's just about us. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she leaned forward, her forehead resting against mine as her hands tightened around mine. "You're making it very hard for me to say no," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Then don't," I replied, my hands moving to cradle her face. "Don't say no." And then, before I could second guess myself, I kissed her. This kiss wasn't like the ones we'd shared before. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was deliberate, filled with all the emotions we'd been holding back. Her lips were warm and soft against mine, and I felt her hands slide up to my shoulders, pulling me closer. The world around us seemed to blur, the colors of the sunset melting into a haze as every sense focused on her. Diane responded with equal intensity, her movements no longer hesitant, but confident, assured. Her fingers tangled in my hair as our kiss deepened, and I felt the heat of her body pressed against mine. The sound of her soft sighs sent a shiver through me, and I found myself pulling her even closer, my hands sliding down to rest at the curve of her waist. The ground beneath us seemed to shift as we moved together, our breaths mingling in the cool evening air. Time lost all meaning. There was only the feel of her lips on mine, the warmth of her touch, the quiet urgency that seemed to grow with every passing second. It was as though we had crossed into a place where nothing else existed. No expectations, no fears, just us. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, Diane's hands lingered on my shoulders, her fingers curling slightly as though she were afraid to let go. Her gaze met mine, and I could see the conflict still lingering in her eyes, though it was tempered now by something deeper. "This is reckless," she said softly, though her tone lacked conviction. "Maybe," I admitted, my hands moving to rest lightly on her hips, "but that doesn't make it wrong." She smiled then, a small, tentative smile that sent a rush of warmth through me. "You're very persuasive," she murmured, her fingers brushing against my jaw. "I'm just telling the truth," I replied, my voice steady. Diane's gaze softened, and she leaned in, her forehead resting against mine once more. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said quietly. "But right now, I don't care." "Neither do I said, my hands tightening slightly on her waist. The hike back to the campsite was a blur, the weight of what had happened between us hanging in the air. Matt was already asleep when we arrived, his snores faint but steady from inside his tent. Diane and I exchanged a glance, unspoken words passing between us, before she disappeared into her tent without a word. I stayed by the fire for a long time, staring into the flames as I tried to make sense of everything. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: exhilaration, fear, hope. But beneath it all was a quiet certainty. Whatever had happened between us, it wasn't something I could walk away from. And I had the sense that Diane felt the same, even if she wasn't ready to say it out loud. The next morning, the tension between us had shifted again. It was no longer hesitant or unsure, but something quieter, more intimate. Every glance, every touch felt deliberate, as though we were silently affirming what we had already acknowledged. As we packed up the campsite, Diane caught my eye, her lips curving into a small, secretive smile that made my heart skip a beat. I returned the smile, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. The final stretch of the hike was steep, the trail winding upward toward the summit. By the time we reached the top, the sun was high in the sky, its rays casting the valley below in a brilliant golden light. Diane and I stood side by side at the edge of the overlook, our shoulders brushing as we took in the view. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. It is, ma'am, I agreed, though my gaze was fixed on her. And she turned to me, her expression softening as her eyes met mine. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For not letting me push you away. I reached for her hand, my fingers brushing against hers before closing around them. Huh. I couldn't have, even if I tried. Her smile widened, and she stepped closer, her other hand resting lightly on my arm. You are impossible, she said, though her tone was warm. Maybe, I replied, my lips curving into a grin. But I think you like that about me. She laughed softly, the sound carrying over the wind. Maybe I do. As we stood there, the world spread out before us and the weight of everything we'd shared settling around us. I realized that whatever came next, it didn't matter. This moment, this connection was ours, and nothing could take it away.